I was sipping coffee at my kitchen table when a squad car pulled up outside my house. Not the usual polished black and whites from the local precinct, but two suspiciously shiny sedans with flashing magnetic lights stuck on their roofs, like something from a discount Halloween store. 3 uniformed officers marched up my walkway with the swagger of men who'd just watched a few too many cop dramas. One even had his badge clipped on upside down. The lead guy banged on my door hard enough to rattle the frame and yelled, "Open up! You're under arrest by order of the Homeowners Association." His voice cracked on the word arrest, and for a brief second I thought I was being pranked. But then I caught sight of my neighbor Karen, the HOA president, standing smugly across the street with her arms crossed, recording the whole thing on her phone like she'd finally engineered her grand victory. That's when I knew this wasn't just a prank, it was Karen's latest power play, and she had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. I opened the door slowly, letting the faux cops posture like they'd just cornered a fugitive. Their uniforms didn't match, their handcuffs still had the price tags dangling, and their belts carried more plastic than steel. One guy even wore sneakers. They ordered me to step outside and turn around, but I just leaned against the frame, calm as ever, because here's the detail Karen never cared to learn. I'm an active field agent with the FBI. And if there's one thing I know better than anyone, it's the difference between law enforcement and cosplay. Karen shouted across the street, "Take him away! He's been violating HOA rules for months. Illegal fence height, unauthorized mailbox, grass an inch too long." Her voice was shrill, the kind that always carried, but what stood out most was the absolute conviction. She believed her rules carried the same weight as federal law, and in her mind, I was some neighborhood criminal who needed to be dealt with. I let the fake officers rattle on for another minute, demanding I comply, threatening me with maximum HOA detention. They were sloppy, fumbling, clearly amateurs, probably friends of Karen's son, bribed with beer and the promise of neighborhood glory. But what none of them realized was that by impersonating federal officers, they weren't just playing dress-up. They were walking straight into felony territory. And Karen had just dragged them all there. I smiled, slow and deliberate, and asked them, "So tell me, gentlemen, which department did you say you were with again?" Their eyes flicked to each other nervously. One muttered, "Neighborhood Enforcement Division." Another mumbled something about Special HOA Task Force. I almost laughed out loud, but instead I pulled out my own badge, polished, real, and carrying the weight of federal authority. I held it up just high enough so Karen could catch the shine from across the street. The color drained from the men's faces. Karen froze, her phone still pointed at me but her jaw falling open. Suddenly the neighborhood stage play had turned into something much bigger than she anticipated. What she thought would be a humiliating arrest for me had just become evidence of her orchestrating a federal crime. And that was only the beginning. Because the moment I shut my door and made the first call to my field office, I knew exactly how I'd play this. Karen thought she was waging an HOA battle. I was about to turn it into a full-blown investigation. That was the day everything shifted. The 3 fake cops scattered like pigeons when I shut the door in their faces, but Karen didn't move an inch. She just stood there on the curb, glaring at my house with that frozen grin plastered across her face, the same one she wore at HOA meetings whenever she thought she had the upper hand. I poured myself another cup of coffee and let the adrenaline settle. Normally, I would have called in backup right away, but I wanted to see how deep Karen's fantasy of power actually ran before I lowered the hammer. The best way to dismantle an entitled empire is to let its ruler keep talking. Later that afternoon, while I was mowing my allegedly illegal-length grass, Karen strutted up in her pastel tracksuit and oversized sunglasses. She planted herself by the fence and announced that my arrest had only been postponed, not cancelled. Her exact words, "You can't hide behind your little badge forever. The HOA has its own authority." I leaned on the mower handle, sweat dripping down my forehead, and gave her the kind of look an FBI instructor gives a rookie who just handcuffed himself to the suspect. She interpreted it as weakness, of course. That's what Karens do. They mistake silence for surrender. But inside, my brain was already mapping out the long game. I filed a quiet report through bureau channels about attempted impersonation of federal officers. No need to send in a SWAT team yet. I didn't want to spook her. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. The very next morning, a stack of HOA violation notices appeared taped to my door. Each was more ridiculous than the last. Improper trash can placement, mailbox flag too distracting, wind chimes exceeding community decibel standards. She even accused me of unauthorized patriotic displays, because I'd hung a small American flag on my porch. The irony was almost poetic. My colleagues at the bureau thought I was joking when I described the situation, but when I sent them the video clip Karen had proudly posted to the neighborhood Facebook group, her shaky footage of the fake cops trying to arrest me, they stopped laughing. One supervisor reminded me that this was technically a felony case now. I assured him I'd handle it carefully. After all, I had a front row seat to the theater, and I wasn't about to close the curtains early. The next escalation came at night. I heard a commotion outside around 11 p.m., and when I checked my security cameras, I caught two of Karen's officers sneaking around my driveway with flashlights. They tried the door handles on my car, peered through the windows, and even whispered about planting evidence. My car isn't just any car. It's wired with bureau-level surveillance gear and remote locking systems. Within seconds, I had crystal-clear video and audio. I didn't confront them that night. I wanted Karen to believe her little squad was still invisible. But I forwarded the footage straight to my office, and by the next morning, 2 real federal agents were itching to step in. Karen, oblivious to the trap she was weaving, called an emergency HOA meeting that weekend. I showed up early, took my usual seat in the back, and watched her perform. She opened the meeting with a slideshow of my infractions, complete with zoomed-in photos of my lawn and dramatic red circles drawn around supposed violations. The crowd of bored homeowners half listened, sipping their coffee, nodding occasionally, but you could tell even they were weary of her crusades. That's when she dropped her masterpiece. As of last week, we initiated a neighborhood security task force. You may have seen our officers patrolling. They are here to keep us safe from people who don't follow the rules. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. A man in the front row whispered something to his wife, and she rolled her eyes. I raised my hand casually. Karen tried to ignore me at first, but the murmurs forced her to acknowledge me. "Yes?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. I stood up slowly, keeping my tone mild. "So, just for clarification, these officers you've deployed, are they licensed through the city, or—" She cut me off. "They don't need licenses. They have HOA authority." That was my cue. I didn't flash my badge yet. I simply smiled and said, "Interesting. Because impersonating law enforcement is a federal offense, and I happen to know some people who take that very seriously." Karen laughed it off, trying to spin it as me being dramatic, but the ripple of unease through the room was unmistakable. Several neighbors started whispering. One older man even asked out loud if the HOA fees were paying for this task force. Karen quickly changed the subject, but the seed was planted. Doubt had crept into her kingdom. That night, she stormed onto my property uninvited, waving her phone like a weapon. She accused me of threatening the community with legal jargon, and warned me to stand down. I didn't even bother replying. I just let her rant while my security cameras recorded every word. The footage captured the wild glint in her eyes, the manic conviction, the way she shouted, "I am the law here!" loud enough to wake half the block. By the time she stomped off, I already knew what would happen next. She'd double down yet again, unable to see the cliff edge looming. And sure enough, 2 days later, her fake officers returned in broad daylight. This time with plastic toy guns painted black. They marched right up my driveway, trying to look intimidating while neighbors peeked through blinds. Karen followed behind like a conquering general, recording the whole thing. That was the moment I finally stepped out onto the porch with my real badge in one hand and my phone in the other, already connected to the bureau. I addressed the fake cops directly. "Gentlemen, you are now being recorded as you commit a federal crime. Drop the props, walk away, and maybe this won't ruin your lives." One of them paled and dropped his plastic gun immediately. The other hesitated, glancing nervously at Karen. She screamed, "Don't listen to him. He's bluffing." I turned the camera toward her and said, "Karen, keep talking. Every word is evidence." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish as the reality finally cracked through. But it was too late. The trap had been sprung. And the best part? I hadn't even played my full hand yet. This was just the prelude. The real investigation was only beginning. By the time word spread about Karen's task force, the neighborhood had split into two camps. Half the residents thought she'd finally lost her mind, while the other half feared what might happen if they crossed her. HOA politics can be strangely tribal. People will tolerate absurdity if they think it keeps the peace. I knew that if I let her keep control of the narrative, she'd spin her failures into some story about me being the villain. So I stayed quiet, collected evidence, and waited for the right moment to let the truth unravel in front of everyone. My bureau supervisor called me into the field office that week. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling through the footage I'd submitted. Karen ordering her fake cops around, the men prowling around my car at night, the toy guns. He gave me that look only supervisors can give, a mix of exasperation and amusement. "You live in the strangest neighborhood in the state," he muttered. Then his tone hardened. "But this isn't just an HOA squabble anymore. You've got impersonation of federal officers, conspiracy, harassment, potential weapons charges. You sure you don't want us to send a team in and shut this down now?" I shook my head. "If we go in now, she'll paint herself as the martyr. The community needs to see her unravel with their own eyes. Otherwise, she'll crawl back into power under some new excuse." He frowned, but he trusted my instincts. "Fine. You've got rope. Don't hang yourself with it." The following weekend, Karen escalated again. She organized a neighborhood parade of compliance. Picture this: Karen marching down the street with her fake officers in tow, handing out little flyers about rule enforcement, knocking on doors like missionaries of control. She even wore a sash with HOA President written in gold glitter, as if she were running for dictator of the cul-de-sac. I stayed inside, curtains drawn, camera rolling. Let her bury herself. But then she crossed a line I hadn't anticipated. She turned her attention to my next-door neighbor, a quiet widower named Tom who kept to himself. His lawn wasn't perfect, his fence was a little crooked, but he was harmless. Karen singled him out in front of the crowd, demanding her fake officers issue a citation for his broken gutter. When Tom, flustered, tried to explain he was saving up to repair it, one of the men actually pulled out his toy gun and pointed it at the ground as intimidation. The crowd gasped. A few kids started crying. Tom looked terrified. That was when I stepped outside. Calm, deliberate, unhurried, because nothing rattles bullies more than composure. I walked right into the middle of Karen's parade, flipped open my badge, and addressed the fake officer. "Drop the toy and step back. Now." The man froze. His hand trembled, and for a second I wondered if he might actually point it at me. But the weight of my stare and the quiet authority in my voice made him falter. He dropped the plastic weapon onto the asphalt with a hollow clatter. The crowd whispered. Karen screamed at him to pick it back up, but he refused. Her control was slipping in real time, and she could feel it. I turned to the neighbors and raised my voice so everyone could hear. "For weeks, these men have been impersonating officers at Karen's request. That's a federal crime. Every one of you who received one of their citations, hold on to it. It's evidence now." Karen shrieked, "He's lying. He's making this all up. He's not FBI, he's just pretending. That was my cue. I pulled out my bureau-issued phone, called my supervisor on speaker, and said, "Agent Collins reporting. Do you want me to brief you on the HOA impersonation case?" My supervisor's voice boomed through the speaker. "Copy that, Collins. Good work collecting evidence. We're preparing warrants as we speak." The neighborhood went silent. The weight of the federal government hung in the air like a storm cloud. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red, her mouth opening and closing without sound. She tried to spin it, stammering about how she was only protecting the community, how the police never respond fast enough, how someone had to take charge. But her words sounded hollow now. The neighbors weren't buying it. That night, Karen didn't retreat quietly. She doubled down once again, but this time her desperation was showing. Around midnight, I caught her and two of her fake officers sneaking into my backyard. My cameras caught everything, them fumbling with bolt cutters, whispering about planting contraband in my shed. I didn't intervene. Instead, I called my bureau contact, and within 15 minutes, 2 unmarked cars rolled up the street. The real agents moved like shadows, surrounding my yard, catching Karen and her men mid-break-in. The sight was almost cinematic. Karen frozen with bolt cutters in hand, one officer half inside my shed, the other holding a duffel bag full of God knows. The agents ordered them to the ground, cuffed them, and read them their rights. Neighbors peeked from their windows again, phones recording, whispers spreading. Karen screamed the whole time about conspiracies and entrapment, her voice echoing through the cul-de-sac. But here's the twist most people didn't see coming. Karen wasn't the true mastermind. During the search, the agents found text messages on her phone from someone higher up, a man on the HOA board who'd been feeding her this fantasy, pushing her to enforce rules with extra authority. He thought he could stay behind the curtain, letting Karen make a fool of herself while he pulled the strings. But Karen, in her fury, shouted his name loud enough for everyone to hear as the cuffs clicked shut. The neighborhood had thought this was all Karen's madness, but suddenly it looked like a deeper conspiracy within the HOA itself. The neighbors, who had been content to stay out of it, were now demanding answers. The illusion of control was shattered, and the cracks were spreading fast. As the unmarked cars pulled away with Karen screaming in the back seat, I stood at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed, watching the neighbors process what they'd just witnessed. The long game had paid off. Karen was neutralized, but the board? The board was still out there, hiding in plain sight. And if there's one thing I know, it's that corruption never dies quietly. This war wasn't over. It was only evolving. The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood looked like a war zone without the debris. People gathered in little knots along the sidewalks, whispering like parishioners after a scandalous sermon. Every conversation began with the same 3 words. Did you hear? No one mowed their lawns, no kids rode their bikes. Everyone just gossiped in low tones while sneaking glances at my house. For once, I wasn't the villain in Karen's script. I was the man who'd unmasked her circus. But I knew better than to take a victory lap. Karen was in custody, yes, but the board member she'd outed? He was still here, silent and calculating. The HOA called for an emergency board meeting that evening. Invitations slipped under doors, written in Karen's old dramatic style, though she was already behind bars. The irony was thick. The very institution she had weaponized against everyone was now scrambling to repair its image. I showed up early, took a seat near the exit, and observed. That's what I do best. Blend into the noise and let others reveal themselves. The board looked uneasy. Richard, the vice president and the man Karen had named during her meltdown, sat at the center of the table. His usual smug composure cracked around the edges. He cleared his throat and tried to spin Karen's downfall as a misunderstanding about community security. He claimed that Task Force had been entirely Karen's invention, an unfortunate personal project gone rogue. A few neighbors bought it, nodding just enough to move things along. But most were skeptical. They'd seen the text. They'd heard Karen scream his name. I let the discussion churn for a while before I raised my hand. Richard visibly flinched when I stood. With all due respect, I began, what Karen did wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated operation, and someone in this room encouraged her. My tone was calm, measured, the way you talk to a suspect you know is guilty but haven't yet handcuffed. Now, I've already submitted evidence to my office. It's only a matter of time before subpoenas start landing. If anyone here has information, now's the time to speak. The room buzzed. A woman in the back piped up that Karen had bragged about board approval for her task force. Another neighbor recalled Richard handing out HOA funds in cash envelopes to cover security expenses. The walls were closing in, and Richard knew it. His face flushed, his jaw tightened, and he snapped back at me. You can't just come in here and play FBI. This is a homeowners association, not a federal case. I didn't raise my voice. I just pulled my badge from my pocket and set it on the table, the gold catching the fluorescent light. That's where you're wrong, I said. This is very much a federal case. Impersonating officers, conspiracy, misuse of funds. That's not HOA business. That's my business. The silence was absolute. Richard tried to laugh it off, but his eyes betrayed panic. He adjourned the meeting abruptly, muttering something about consulting legal counsel, and left without looking anyone in the eye. The neighbors stayed behind, murmuring. They weren't loyal to Karen anymore, and they certainly weren't rallying to Richard. The board was fractured. That night, as I sat on my porch, I noticed a car idling too long at the end of the street. Not a neighbor's car. Dark windows, no plates on the front. Whoever sat inside wasn't watching the neighborhood, they were watching me. That was the moment I realized Richard wasn't acting alone. Someone else had skin in this game, and they had resources beyond Karen's delusions. The next day, my security cameras caught a stranger trying to pry open my mailbox. He was clean-cut, dressed like a contractor, but his movements were too precise, too practiced. I confronted him, and he bolted before I could catch him. A few minutes later, I got an anonymous call on my burner phone. The voice was distorted, calm, and chilling. Back off the HOA investigation. You've made your point. Let it go. I didn't respond. I just let the silence hang until the caller hung up. When I reported the incident to my bureau supervisor, his reaction was immediate. We're assigning you backup. This isn't just HOA politics anymore. You're poking at organized fraud. Property management scams, laundering, kickbacks. These people use HOAs as fronts all the time. Looks like your Karen just stumbled into a bigger hive. That night, 2 bureau agents parked unmarked vehicles at opposite ends of the street. The neighborhood didn't know it, but they were under quiet surveillance now. My house became the center of a sting operation, and my neighbors thought I was just sipping coffee on the porch like always. Richard must have sensed the noose tightening, because he made a desperate move. He showed up at my door, unannounced, all fake charm and nervous smiles. Listen, he began, I think we've had a misunderstanding. Karen was unwell. She exaggerated things. The board had no idea. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. But you're a reasonable man. What if we made it worth your while to let this go? He slid an envelope across my porch table. I didn't touch it, didn't even look at it. I just kept my eyes on him until the sweat broke across his forehead. Then I asked, very softly, Are you attempting to bribe a federal agent, Richard? He stammered, backpedaled, grabbed the envelope like it was burning his hand. He muttered something about, just trying to smooth things over, and stumbled away. Every word, every movement, had been captured by the microphone hidden in my porch light. Within 48 hours, bureau accountants traced the money trail. Richard had been funneling HOA dues into shell accounts, paying off friends, and funding Karen's fake security theater. But the kicker? Some of those accounts led to a regional developer with a history of shady land grab. Karen had thought she was the queen, but she'd really been a pawn. I played my part at the next HOA meeting like nothing had happened. Richard sat stiffly at the table, dark circles under his eyes, his power evaporating in real time. Neighbors demanded answers about the missing funds, the fake task force, the bribery rumors. I didn't need to say much. The evidence was already in motion behind the scenes. Then came the twist. Midway through the meeting, Karen appeared. Out on bail, disheveled but defiant, she stormed into the room and pointed straight at Richard. He told me to do it. He promised the board would protect me. He said I'd be a hero. The room erupted. Richard shouted back, denying everything, but Karen had nothing left to lose. She spilled names, details, transactions. Half of it was exaggerated, but enough of it was true to bury him. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as their self-appointed royalty tore each other apart. I sat back, arms crossed, letting the chaos play out. This was what I'd been waiting for, the implosion from within. Every word Karen shrieked was more rope around Richard's neck. By the end of the night, the HOA was in shambles. Karen was rearrested for violating her bail terms. Richard fled before the meeting ended, but the Bureau was already tracking him. The neighbors were left staring at each other, realizing the empire they'd propped up for years had been rotten from the start. As I walked home under the glow of the streetlights, I knew the war was almost over. Not quite, though. The developer's name still lingered at the edge of the evidence, a shadow waiting to step into the light. The sun rose over the cul-de-sac with the deceptive calm of any other suburban morning. Sprinklers hissed to life, birds chirped, and kids biked to school, but beneath the veneer, the entire neighborhood was trembling from what had unfolded the past week. Karen had been exposed, Richard was cornered, and the board was collapsing. Yet my instincts told me the real storm was still ahead. The loose threads, the developer, the money trail, the threats, were far too neatly woven for Karen's delusions alone. She was reckless, not strategic. Someone bigger had been steering this ship. That morning, I received a sealed packet from my bureau courier. Inside were transcripts, bank records, and a set of photographs. The money funneled through Richard's accounts didn't stop with him. It led to a holding company, then another shell, and finally to a man named Victor Langford, regional developer, serial donor to politicians, and the kind of smiling parasite who knew how to turn neighborhoods into profit machines. Langford had been quietly pressuring HOAs across the county to enforce absurd rules, push out long-time residents, and depress property values. Once homeowners were desperate to sell, his companies swooped in, bought cheap, and flipped for millions. Karen thought she was queen. Richard thought he was kingmaker. But Langford? He was the puppet master. That evening, I attended what was supposed to be a special session of the HOA. Attendance was mandatory, at least on paper, though no one wanted to be there. The community center smelled of burnt coffee and cheap disinfectant, and the air was thick with tension. Richard was absent, probably hiding with his lawyer. Karen's seat was empty too, her bail revoked after her outburst. Instead, sitting casually at the head of the table, was Langford himself. A man in a tailored suit, cufflinks gleaming, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself smoothly, as if he were the savior swooping in to clean up the mess. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice silky, "your association has gone through an unfortunate episode, but we can restore stability. My firm specializes in community development, and with a little restructuring, we can ensure order, safety, and increased property values." The neighbors shifted uneasily. They weren't sure who this outsider was, but his confidence carried weight. He spoke like a man used to winning. He framed Karen as a tragic example of unchecked enthusiasm, painting Richard as a rogue treasurer who had misallocated funds. It was a performance designed to lull them back into compliance. When he asked for questions, I raised my hand. "Agent Collins," I said clearly, flashing my badge so everyone could see. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'd like to ask how you explain your name appearing on the accounts Richard used to funnel HOA money." The room went silent. Langford didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "I think you're mistaken," he replied smoothly. I donate to many community causes. If my name appeared, it was likely a clerical error or a routine investment. I stepped closer, letting the weight of the silence stretch. Funny thing about clerical errors. They usually don't involve offshore accounts and shell corporations registered in 3 different countries. The neighbors gasped. Someone dropped their coffee cup. Langford's mask slipped just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "This is a private homeowners' meeting," he said coldly. "You have no jurisdiction here." That was my cue. 2 agents from the back of the room stood, badges out. Actually, one of them said, "We do." Langford's composure cracked, but he recovered quickly, pivoting into threats. "Do you realize who I am? I have senators on speed dial. I've built half this county. You think anyone cares about some HOA squabble?" I leaned on the table, meeting his eyes. "This isn't about an HOA. This is about fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. You used Karen and Richard as pawns, and you thought no one would trace it back. But you got sloppy. And now the entire neighborhood has witnessed your attempt to seize control." Langford's smile vanished. For the first time, he looked cornered. He tried to walk out, but the agents intercepted him at the door. A warrant was read aloud. Handcuffs clicked. The neighbors, wide-eyed, recorded every second on their phones. The mighty developer, paraded out like a petty thief. As he was escorted away, Karen's voice rang in my memory, her shrill insistence that she was the law here. The truth was simpler. She was just another desperate soul who wanted control, and she'd been played like a violin by someone with real power. In the days that followed, the neighborhood changed. Without Karen's chaos or Richard's manipulation, the HOA crumbled. The board resigned en masse, leaving only a few weary homeowners to keep the lights on. A vote was held to dissolve the association altogether. For the first time in years, people laughed on their porches without fear of citations. Tom finally fixed his gutter, kids left bikes in driveways without incident, and the sound of wind chimes returned to the evening air. One night, a small group of neighbors gathered at my place with beers and pizza. They wanted to thank me, though I reminded them I'd only done my job. Still, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of watching their relief, their newfound camaraderie. The war was over. Karen's trial made headlines for a week before fading into the background noise of suburban scandals. Richard cut a deal, trading testimony for a reduced sentence. Langford? He was indicted on a laundry list of charges. It would take years to unwind his empire, but the first domino had fallen. As for me, I stayed in the neighborhood. Not because I loved HOA politics, but because I'd grown oddly protective of the people here. They weren't perfect. They'd let Karen run wild far too long, but when push came to shove, they'd chosen truth over tyranny. On quiet evenings, I still catch myself scanning the street for unmarked cars or listening for the crackle of fake radios. Old habits die hard. But mostly, life has settled into something close to normal. Every so often, a neighbor jokes about nominating me for HOA president. I always laugh it off. After what we'd all been through, the last thing I'd ever want is that title. And yet, sometimes when the wind catches the flag on my porch, I think back to the night Karen screamed, "I am the law here," and I can't help but smile. Because now, in this little corner of suburbia, everyone knows the truth. The law doesn't come from HOA meetings or glittery sashes. The law comes when a badge is real, when justice is patient, and when arrogance finally meets accountability. And I was just the guy stubborn enough to let Karen dig her own grave, brick by entitled brick, until the whole rotten structure collapsed on top of her. That was the end of Karen's empire. And the beginning of peace.